On Christmas Eve, 1800, a group of conspirators attempted to assassinate the first consul of the First French Republic. That in itself wasn't all that surprising. It was a period of political turmoil. There were as many as 30 attempts on the life of that particular consul. But the Christmas Eve attempt in 1800 at the Rue Saint Nicaise and its use of what was called an infernal machine would be a turning point in the life of the first consul, one Napoleon Bonaparte. And it would redefine the very concept of assassination and bring a new meaning to a term that is all too familiar today: terrorist.
The French Revolution was, in reality, far more complex than the goals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In fact, the revolution wasn't driven by a single faction or philosophy, but represented numerous different groups, many often rivals, with differing ideas as to the meaning and goals of the revolution. The revolution spurred waves of violence, sometimes between factions in open civil war, as well as conflict with other nations, whose rulers feared the spread of revolutionary ideas. These wars led to the rise of a particularly gifted and successful Corsican general, while internal strife gave rise to a new term. While the term terror is derived from Latin, the term terrorist is derived from the French Revolution. One faction was originally called the Society of Friends of the Constitution, but generally called the Jacobins, as their meeting place was the old Dominican convent of St. Jacques. The Jacobins were largely leftist or liberals, seeking greater reform and to unify against moderates and conservatives, although there were factions within the club as well. In the face of external war and internal strife, including food riots and armed rebellion, in 1793 the Jacobins took control of the legislative body, the National Convention, and instituted a committee on public safety. The committee then engaged in systematic acts of violence against their rivals. The general idea was that violence was necessary to purge internal enemies and protect the Republic and restore order. The series of massacres and public executions that followed became known as the Reign of Terror. The Latin word means to fill with fear or dread, and the Jacobins embraced the term, with a 1793 declaration of the Convention saying that terror is the order of the day. And the most influential Jacobin leader on the Committee for Public Safety, Maximilien Robespierre, arguing that the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is baneful, and terror, without which virtue is powerless. A new word was thus coined as perpetrators of the Reign of Terror started to call themselves terrorists. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned. Tens of thousands were killed. The Reign of Terror collapsed for multiple reasons. French victory against the Allies in what came to be called the War of the First Coalition lessened the need for harsh wartime policies. But the reign had started to threaten too many people, including members of the Convention. The response was partly a moderate reaction, but partly self-defense, as Robespierre and 21 of his supporters were arrested on July 27, 1794, and were then quickly executed, the last victims of the Reign of Terror, although the reaction included a new terror as the radical left was violently purged, including the largest mass execution to ever taken place in Paris. While the new Directory attempted to restrain excess and restore order, it was a time of economic and political instability and continued external wars. The Directory was known for maladministration and corruption. Too often, the Directorate relied on the force of the military to keep or restore order, something that shifted too much power to the generals, who built their reputations on military successes. Unable to deliver stability and losing popular support, the Directory was overthrown in a series of coups d'etat. On November 9, 1799, multiple factions worked together to end the Directory and promulgate a new constitution that would have more central authority, bringing the most famous and popular of the revolutionary generals, Napoleon Bonaparte, in as the head of a new consulate, in a hope simply for order. While there were 3 members of the Consul, virtual dictatorial control lay in the hands of Bonaparte, the new first consul. The bloodless coup occurred on the 18th day of the second month of the only briefly used French Republican calendar, and so is generally called the coup of 18 Brumaire. The coup and constitution that followed are usually considered by historians to represent the end of the French Revolution. This is all a simplification of a complex period, but Napoleon came into power, essentially via a coup within a coup, in the middle of a fractious time, and with enemies on both the right and the left. Broadly speaking, his most dangerous political rivals were the neo-Jacobins on the left, moderates who had survived the purge of Robespierre and who saw the new constitution as a violation of the revolutionary principles, and royalists on the right who sought to restore the House of Bourbon to the throne. Attempts to end Bonaparte's rule started early. Napoleon's valet Louis Constant reported in a memoir, for example, that an attempt to replace Napoleon's snuff box with a duplicate filled with poison was discovered in 1800. A memoir by Joseph Fouché, head of the Paris police, detailed a conspiracy that was discovered to simply have a group of men stab Bonaparte with knives as he was leaving an opera house. The plot was revealed before it could occur, and the conspirators were arrested by Fouché. 4 men were convicted and executed for participating in the plot. It's difficult to determine how serious these plots actually were, nor exactly who was involved. Constant and Fouché are not entirely reliable as sources, and there was political reason to overstate the threat. The dagger plot, for example, might have been the machinations of an agent provocateur employed by the police. Fouché himself wrote that the police agents, sent in as spies amongst them and to whom they gave daggers, urged them on to a degree of guilt which before, perhaps, they had not contemplated. 4 men, Jacobins, were convicted and executed for the conspiracy, but even this was in question, as Napoleon seemed more interested in punishing those it was most politically expedient to purge, rather than identifying the actual perpetrators. In any case, the seriousness of the attempt on Bonaparte's life made on Christmas Eve, 1800, could not be denied. The Salisbury Journal explains, yesterday at 8 o'clock in the evening, as the first consul was going to the opera with his picket guard in the Rue Nicaise, a sorry wagon drawn by 1 horse was placed so as to interrupt the passage. The coachman, though driving very quick, had addressed enough to avoid the obstacle. In an instant, a terrible explosion broke all the glasses of the carriage, wounded the horse of the last man on the picket, and killed 3 women, a grocer, and a child. The number wounded, as far as is known, amounts to 15 persons, consisting chiefly of the passers-by and the proprietors of the adjoining houses. All the windows were broken, and a number of houses otherwise damaged. The explosion was heard throughout Paris. A part of the wheel was blown over the rods into the courtyard of Consul Jean-Jacques du Combeserres. The journal reported that the intent was that its discharge should overturn and destroy everything that was near it. The explosion had to be significant to do the damage described. The journal explained that it appeared this wagon contained a sort of infernal machine. The term infernal machine, or machine infernale in French, likely dates back to 1585, when Italian engineer Federico Giambelli filled a boat with explosives and rock and used it to destroy a bridge during the siege of Antwerp by Spanish forces during the 80 Years' War. The term referred to any random destructive device, and its use continued into the 20th century to refer usually to homemade explosive devices. In this case, the journal explains, the infernal machine was a cask filled with powder and ball. A gun barrel, loaded, was placed in it, with a lock to which was fastened a string to occasion a discharge when it was wished. Modern estimates suggest that the cask, bound with iron rings, held some 200 pounds of gunpowder. Despite its force, though, the machine had missed its target. The Portland, Maine Gazette reported the machine was placed on a carriage and pushed into the street at what was deemed a proper time. Some negligence delayed the operation, so that when it took place, although fatal to many, the intended victim escaped. The Salisbury Journal wrote, the first consul pursued his way, and attended the oratorio. It was, however, a close thing. The Salisbury Journal noted but 1 second less, and the first consul, with all his suite, would have been enveloped in the dreadful explosion. It isn't clear exactly why the timing was off. A plotter, later identified as Pierre de Lamoillon, was supposed to watch for the carriage and signal another plotter, Pierre de Saint-Regent, to light a fuse, which would take a few seconds to burn, giving him time to escape. By some accounts, Lamoillon failed to give the signal, perhaps chickening out. By others, the signal simply came late, potentially because the consul's carriage was moving faster than expected. In a bizarre twist, this may have been, some newspapers claimed, because Napoleon's driver, a man named Chavez, was drunk. Another account says that one of the guards pushed a path around the wagon and it momentarily blocked Saint-Regent's view. Saint-Regent, who was injured in the blast, perhaps self-servingly later claimed that the gunpowder was not as good as it should have been, and therefore the explosion took place 2 to 3 seconds later than estimated. If not, the first consul would certainly have been killed. The fault, he said, lies with the gunpowder, and not the assassin. Bonaparte had left ahead of a second coach carrying his wife Josephine, her daughter Hortense, Napoleon's sister Caroline Bonaparte, and a general, Jean Rapp. The explosion had come between the 2 carriages, just as the second carriage had exited the palace. Its windows were shattered, and Hortense received a small injury on her hand from the broken glass. Rapp later reported that the carriage had been delayed as Josephine fussed with her shawl. It seems fate had saved both carriages. But others were not so lucky, with the streets crowded on Christmas Eve. One victim was Marianne Pousseau, a girl whose age was reported to be either 12 or 14. Saint Regent had paid the girl 12 sous to hold his mare for a few moments. The girl likely considered the offer a stroke of good luck, having no idea what was coming. Accounts differ as to the number, but some reports say as many as 52 were killed or injured. It was a shocking event. At a later inquiry, a naturalist testified that if the authors of it were in their senses, the machine could not have been intended to destroy a particular person, but was calculated to kill a number of persons if they happened to be huddled together in a crowd. Juan Jose Sanchez Arasagio noted in a 2019 edition of National Geographic that it was neither the first nor the last attack against Napoleon. However, it was unique in that it targeted an individual but was indiscriminate in its impact. This was an act that took political dissent in a new direction. Previously, the word terrorist and terrorism had been applied to a government inflicting systematic terror upon its people. Suddenly, the term came to mean what we see it in the modern sense, shifting from state power to non-state actors using violence for political ends. Bonaparte, for his part, seemed surprisingly unperturbed. After inquiring after the second carriage and his empress, Rapp recalled that he said very coolly, "The rascals wanted to blow me up. Bring me a book of the oratorio." The Salisbury Journal reported that when several senators yesterday expressed their horror and affliction to Bonaparte, he answered, "What would you have? It's in the first place of the magistracy, exactly as upon the field of battle," and added, "You should not have come to see me. You should go immediately to help those poor wretched people." During the trial, it was revealed that the Salisbury Journal noted government, it appears, was long appraised of the probability that such an attempt would be made. Some plotters had been found and arrested with a partially prepared infernal device. Bonaparte and Fouché apparently were convinced that the plot had been foiled. The conspirators were royalists, and Fouché was able to uncover the plot quickly. The horse had been killed and cart destroyed, but he was able to locate a grain dealer who could identify both and describe the man who purchased them. A reward was posted for the man, François-Jean Carbon, who was apprehended and under questioning gave the names of his conspirators. Carbon and Saint-Regent were captured, convicted, and executed. But Bonaparte was convinced that the plot was planned by Jacobins, or at least he saw greater value in purging Jacobins, whom he saw to be the greater threat. Telling Fouché, "For such an atrocious crime we must have vengeance, like a thunderbolt. Blood must flow. We must shoot as many guilty men as there have been victims." At his insistence, at least 130 were arrested on very thin evidence, most of them sent into exile. Arasiego writes, "Napoleon was able to punish and purge his enemies on both sides, toppling potential threats to his authoritarian ambition." The plot of the infernal machine came at an important point in history. Its failure meant that Napoleon had the sympathy of the people, the power, having purged his enemies, and the excuse to end the Republic and proclaim himself emperor. He had leveraged the chaos of the revolution to rise to supreme power, with many of his most significant campaigns coming as emperor. The attempt had propelled him to new heights and gave him the ability to pull the whole continent into war. But that, likewise, leaves open the question of how different history might have been had the device Infernal exploded just a few seconds sooner. History turned on just a few ticks of the clock. Those few ticks of the clock would mean much to the United Kingdom, whose fortune would be stretched fighting the man now called Emperor. Ironic, as Tom Holmberg of the Waterloo Association writes, that the diary of William Wyndham, the English Secretary at War, revealed that the plot, called the coup essential, had been secretly funded by the British.
This was by no means the first group that would act in ways that today we would call terrorism, but it was the first act to which that term was applied, an act that would be all too familiar today. And there's a final twist. Pierre de Lamothe, who was the conspirator who was supposed to signal when to set off the bomb, managed to escape arrest and make his way to the United States, where, according to the Washington Post, he made money selling art and entered the seminary, changing his name to Clariviere. He eventually became the director of the community at the Georgetown Visitation Monastery in the Georgetown section of the District of Columbia. He used money from selling lands in France to build a chapel and is still, according to the Post, revered today as the Visitation's second founder. And so the man that tried to kill Napoleon, who helped to invent what today we would call the improvised explosive device, is buried in the basement of a monastery in the United States Capitol by monks and nuns who probably had no idea of his actual past. The stone simply reads, "The difficulties of the time and divine providence forced him to leave his native land and make his way to this country." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. Isn't that cool? Funny story, huh? True story. Yeah?